Welcome to the deep dive. We take a stack of your sources, the articles, the research, the notes, and we unpack the most important nuggets.
Yeah, helping you shortcut your way to being genuinely well-informed on some pretty complex stuff.
And in this deep dive, wow, we're exploring a really fascinating idea.
It is fascinating. It's the surprising connection between, well, some of history's greatest artists and the cutting-edge discoveries of neuroscience.
Right. We've got material here suggesting that artists, just through their intense exploration of what it means to be human, they actually anticipated tangible truths about the mind.
Yeah, about consciousness, long before science really had the tools to, confirm them.
So our mission today is to dig into these sources, find those key insights where art and science kind of meet.
hmm And understand how imagination might, in a way, actually foretell the facts of the future. It's a pretty big idea.
It really is. So the central question we're grappling with is, how did writers, like Walt Whitman, George Eliot, Proust, or painters like Cézanne, composers like Stravinsky, how did they uncover these fundamental truths about our minds?
Truths that neuroscience is, in some cases, only just rediscovering now.
Exactly. So let's get into it.
Okay, what's particularly striking right from the start in this material is the core argument.
Which challenges that traditional view, right?
Yeah, it challenges the idea that knowledge is only advanced by objective science. These sources are arguing that artists play this crucial, often overlooked role,
In uncovering truths about reality.
especially the subjective reality of human experience. What it feels like to be us.
Yeah, we tend to think of artists just telling stories or, making pretty things separate from the serious business of science describing the universe objectively.
But this material suggests artists were doing their own kind of research. A different kind, maybe. I mean, think about the artists we're focusing on. Whitman, Eliot, Proust, Stein, Cézanne, Stravinsky, Woolf.
They were living right when modern science was starting.
Exactly, the dawn of modern science.
Yeah.
And they were engaged with it. Whitman was studying brain anatomy. Eliot was reading Darwin and Maxwell.
Gertrude Stein was actually in William James's psychology lab.
She was, literally. But, and this is the key point, they still believed art was essential.
Why? What was art doing that science wasn't?
They wanted to understand consciousness from the inside. That's the phrase used here, focusing on what reality feels like.
Which science at the time just wasn't equipped for.
Right, it was more focused on breaking things down, measuring.
And their methods were so varied.
Totally. Proust ruminating in his cork-lined room, Cézanne just staring at an apple for hours on end.
Stein playing with words, Ascafia obsessing over flavor.
But they all shared this, deep, almost obsessive interest in the nuances of human experience, the mysteries of the mind that science was either ignoring or reducing to simple parts.
It's still surprising how much they were influenced by the science of their day, though. It wasn't like they were completely isolated.
True, they weren't operating in a vacuum. But the sources make it really clear they weren't just, translating scientific ideas into poems or paintings.
They were doing something else.
They were exploring experience itself to express what experiments couldn't capture. And that's why their art lasts, right? It captures something deeper than the specific scientific models of their time, which often change.
So the big takeaway from this first section is pretty profound. They're kind of made of both art and science.
In a fundamental sense, yes. Science describes the universe objectively, sure. But art helps us understand what it feels like to be a conscious being in that universe.
Science needs art to frame the mystery.
And art needs science, so not everything is a total mystery.
Right. Neither one alone gives the full picture.
Our reality exists in plural, as the sources say. To really describe something as complex as the human brain, you need both cultures. You need both perspectives.
Okay, let's dive into some specifics then. How did these artists actually anticipate scientific truths? First up is Walt Whitman.
Yes, Whitman. And his really radical idea about the substance of feeling, how deeply the body and mind are connected.
His big idea, especially in Leaves of Grass, was that we are a body, not just have one.
Exactly. Body and mind, or soul, were totally interwedded, as he put it. Feelings weren't just thoughts floating around. They literally started in the flesh.
And his method was unusual.
He basically turned himself into a human lab subject, an empiricist of his own experience, trying to put himself freely, fully, and truly on record.
Which flew in the face of the thinking back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You had Descartes' dualism, separating the soul from the body, the mortal machine.
And phrenology was big then too, right? Mapping bumps on the skull?
Yeah, trying to locate the soul just in the head, treating the body as basically irrelevant. Whitman rejected that kind of reductionism. He saw the human being as this irreducible whole.
It's funny, though, the sources mention he had this weird relationship with phrenology.
Yeah. Apparently skeptical, called one lecture preposterous.
But used phonologists as his publishers.
A practical moves, maybe. But his poetry fundamentally argued against their whole premise. You couldn't understand the soul by ignoring the body.
And this poetic idea had a huge impact on William James.
The pioneer psychologist, yeah. James was an avid Whitman reader.
Really? A scientist reading poetry for insight?
Absolutely. And James was maybe the first scientist to seriously consider Whitman's idea that the body is the source of feelings and think, hey, this might be literally true.
James was setting up his lab then, wasn't he?
He was, but he was wary of what he called brass instrument psychology, just trying to measure everything. He was drawn to the messy, subjective stuff.
And his famous theory of emotion sounds so much like Whitman.
It really does. In his 1884 article, What is Emotion?, James argued feelings emerge from the interaction of the brain and the body, not just the brain.
He used that bear example, right?
Yeah, the classic example. You see a bear, your heart races, you tremble, your breath gets shallow. James argued the feeling of fear is the perception of all those bodily changes.
So without the physical sensations, the emotion itself wouldn't exist or would be totally different.
That was his argument. A purely disembodied feeling was, for him, inconceivable.
Okay, so Whitman feels this connection intuitively. James turns it into a scientific hypothesis based on experience, and then modern neuroscience comes along.
And provides some really powerful support. Antonio Damasio's work on what he calls carnal emotions.
Carnal emotion.
Yeah, but basically emotions rooted in the body. His research confirms that the body contributes essential content to the mind. He's even shown the brain can simulate bodily changes and as if body loop, and that alone can induce emotion.
And his finding that rationality needs feelings. That's wild.
It is. His patients with brain damage affecting emotions, they really struggled with making decisions, even simple ones.
It really brings that Nietzsche quote to life. There's more reason in your body than in your best wisdom.
It does. And Damasio's gambling task experiment is just a perfect illustration.
That's the one with the rigged card decks.
Exactly. Some decks have big wins, but even bigger unpredictable losses, the risky decks. Others have smaller wins and smaller losses, the safe ones.
And he measured sweat.
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
Skin conductance, a measure of nervousness, in their palms. And what he found was amazing. The players' hands started showing stress signals getting sweaty about the risky decks after only about 10 cards.
Only 10, but they didn't consciously know the decks were bad yet.
Nope. Their conscious brains didn't figure out the pattern, couldn't articulate why they preferred the safe decks until much, much later. Around 50 to 80 cards in.
So the body, the hand, knew something was up way before the conscious mind did.
The unconscious feeling preceded the rational decision. The hand led the mind.
Incredible. And Whitman wrote about the curious sympathy one feels when feeling with the hand.
And that the spirit receives from the body just as much as it gives. He just knew it.
Yeah. So his intuition that feelings grow out of the flesh like leaves from dirt, it wasn't just a metaphor.
It captured a fundamental truth about how our emotions are physically grounded. It tells us we can't understand ourselves just by looking at the brain in a jar.
Okay, let's shift to another artist wrestling with these big questions, George Eliot.
Yes, Eliot, and what the sources call the blessing of chaos. Her focus on freedom versus determinism.
Her novels are amazing, weaving science like physics and Darwin right into the characters' lives.
And she argued strongly against the idea that we're just constrained by biology or environment. She felt the mind wasn't cut in marble. We could will ourselves to change.
And this was when thinkers like Laplace were pushing for social physics, right?
Yeah, the idea you could predict human behavior mathematically, like planets. Laplace's demon thought experiment.
If you knew everything, you could predict everything.
Exactly. Implying no real freedom, just physical laws playing out.
But physics itself started finding cracks in that idea.
Right. You had Thomson and the second law of thermodynamics entropy, the universe tending towards chaos, not perfect order.
And Maxwell.
Maxwell showed that even physical laws were more like statistical averages for large groups, not absolute certainties for individual particles. Disorder was real.
And Eliot herself went through a personal shift, didn't she?
Yes, her early belief in positivism, in finding absolute objective truth, kind of crumbled after a heartbreak.
With Herbert Spencer.
Yeah. It was an experience that logic alone couldn't really encompass or fix. And her partner, G.H. Lewis, also felt the brain was just too complex to ever be fully predicted. Maybe freedom was partly a result of our own ignorance.
So by the time she wrote her later novels like Daniel Deronda,
She'd concluded that Laplace and the strict determinists were wrong. Freedom, however fragile, however difficult, exists.
like her character Gwendolyn, who solves herself.
Exactly. She navigates incredible constraints, escapes a terrible marriage, demonstrating this capacity for change, for self-direction. The sources use that great casino metaphor. Humans aren't clockwork. They're like the secretive form emerging from chance, finding their own path.
And she was okay with Darwinian randomness?
She embraced it, saw randomness not just as something hiding a deeper order, but as a fundamental fact of nature. This intrinsic mystery of life was key to her work.
But science, particularly biology, later swung back towards a more deterministic view for a while.
It did, yeah. The idea that the brain was basically fixed after childhood like a genetically programmed machine, no new neurons, functions rigidly localized.
Until modern neuroscience just blew that apart.
Completely. You had Altman, Kaplan, and especially Fernando Nottebohm discovering neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in adult brains.
In birds first, right. Learning songs.
Yes, showing it was essential for complex learning. And Nottebohm's finding that context mattered, birds in cages had less neurogenesis, was crucial. You can't just study life in a biological vacuum.
The sources call neurogenesis cellular evidence that we evolved to never stop evolving.
It's a great line. To be alive is to be ceaselessly beginning.
And then there's neuroplasticity.
The brain's incredible ability to reorganize itself based on experience. Michael Merzenek's work, Ragunkasur's ferret experiment,
Where they rerouted visual input to the auditory part of the brain.
and the ferrets learned to see with it. It shows radical adaptability. Blind people using their visual cortex for braille, deaf individuals for sign language, recovery after brain injury. It all points to experience shapes the brain.
Even the Human Genome Project didn't seal the deal for determinism.
Quite the opposite. It showed the limits of genetic determinism. Genome size doesn't correlate neatly with complexity. Some amoebas have way bigger genomes than us.
So our brains aren't just strictly programmed by genes.
No, our plasticity allows us to, in a sense, transcend the genome. We emerge character-like, as the source puts it. Freedom, in this view, means there aren't single fixed solutions dictated by our genes. We participate in what our brains become.
And chaos itself plays a role in making us unique.
That's a fascinating, more recent idea. Building on Kimmer's theory that a lot of evolution at the DNA level is just random chance, drift.
Now they're finding disorder inside cells.
Yes. Fred Gage's work on retrotransposons, these junk genes that jump around randomly within neurons, changing their genetic programs.
That sounds potentially damaging.
You'd think so. But Gage proposes this mental anarchy. It isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's adaptive. This randomness creates perfectly unique minds. Chaos creates individuality.
It explains why even identical twins end up with very different brains.
Exactly. Biology seems to thrive on a certain amount of disorder. Life isn't a predictable clockwork mechanism.
More like a cloud, as Karl Popper said. Irregular, unpredictable.
Spot on. And George Eliot, writing way before neurogenesis or jumping genes, she intuitively grasped this. Life isn't a machine. We are, in some fundamental way, free. Works in progress.
Blessed and burdened by this elastic nature.
There are always constraints. Biology matters. But within those, we make our own way. Eliot saw that.
Incredible connection. Okay, let's change gears completely. Taste. Auguste Escoffier.
Ah, Escoffier. The master chef who wanted to bring a scientific kind of rigor to cooking.
Codifying recipes, inventing modern veal stock by meticulously extracting flavor from bones. Very systematic.
But, and this is the interesting part, despite that drive for scientific precision, his core insight was all about the tongue, its exquisite sensitivity.
For him, what mattered most was the experience, what it tasted like.
Ultimately, yes. Experience alone can guide the cook, he said. Subjective experience was the final judge.
Which ties in perfectly with the whole story of umami.
It does. The Japanese chemist, Kikunae Ikeda, back in 1907,
Yeah.
he's tasting dashi, this fundamental kelp broth.
And realizes it's not sweet, sour, salty, or bitter.
Right, it's something else, something delicious. He calls it umami.
And he figures out the molecule glutamic acid, L-glutamate.
And develops MSG, monosodium glutamate, to capture that pure umami taste. Salty, but Not quite salt, not sweet, not sour, not bitter, just savory deliciousness.
But Western science was really resistant at first.
Very resistant. They were stuck on the four basic tastes. Even though chefs everywhere were using ingredients packed with glutamate parmesan, tomatoes, meat stocks, soy
The
sauce.
science needed proof, like actual taste receptors.
Exactly. They needed anatomical evidence, not just subjective reports, however widespread. Took a long time, but eventually specific glutamate receptors were found on the tongue.
Which finally proved umami was real, a fifth basic taste. The tongue's definition of delicious.
And it makes biological sense, right? We crave protein for survival, and glutamate is a key amino acid. Breast milk is full of it. The tongue loves what the body needs.
But taste isn't just the tongue, is it? The sources talk about smell.
Oh, hugely important. Smell and taste work together in the brain in incredibly complex ways. Think about a rich smell, like a demi-glace.
It's made of hundreds of different aroma molecules.
And the brain somehow takes all those disparate signals from hundreds of different small receptors and binds them into one coherent sensation. That's the binding problem.
And then there's the parsing problem.
Yeah, if you smell a whole dish with multiple ingredients, how does your brain figure out which smell signals belong to the carrot, which to the beef, which to the herbs?
Our ability to focus on one smell seems effortless.
But neuroscience finds it a profound mystery. How does selective attention work with smells?
And this complexity makes taste and smell really subjective, easily influenced.
Totally. The sources use that great example. Parmesan cheese and vomit both contain butyric acid, chemically similar in that one aspect.
But one smells delicious, the other, not so much.
Our brain's interpretation, our common sense, our context overrides the raw sensation. Context is king.
And Escoffier was a master of context.
Absolutely. He used the power of suggestion. Think about his restaurants, the fancy names for dishes, the elegant plating, the decor, the waiters in tuxedos.
He said even horse meat could be delicious in the right circumstances.
He did. What we taste isn't just chemicals on the tongue. It's an idea heavily influenced by our expectations and the whole environment.
It reminds me of that philosopher Davidson. You can't separate your interpretation, your scheme, from the external reality, the content.
They're tangled together. You're already judging the taste before it even hits your tongue, in a way.
And people vary wildly in how sensitive they are to tastes and smells.
Hugely. Up to 1,000-fold difference. And the neurology behind it is fascinating. The olfactory cortex, where smell is processed, is super plastic.
It rewires itself based on experience.
Yes, it literally arranges itself around the smells and tastes you encounter regularly. New neurons are constantly being born in the olfactory bulb, and whether they survive depends on what you smell. Your brain's smell map reflects your life experiences, what you eat.
So Escoffier wasn't just making food, he was shaping people's sensory worlds.
His recipes and the whole experience he created literally taught people what to desire, what delicious meant in that context. He trusted his own experience, his palate, over the limited science of his day.
That quote sums it up. No theory, no formula, and no recipe can take the place of experience.
He knew subjective truth came first in taste.
Let's move to memory. Marcel Proust and The Lie of Yesterday.
Proust, famous for his deep dives into his own past, relying on intuition.
And he came to believe memory is fundamentally unreliable. Phony.
Yeah, that's the word the sources use. He felt our recollections are these elaborate constructions, fabrications. We warp the facts to fit the story we want to tell ourselves now. Intelligence reworks the experience.
Yeah.
He was deeply skeptical.
Even early neuroscience, like Ramon y Cajal, guessed memories involved physical changes at the synapse.
Right, some kind of physical trace. But the really surprising discovery, the one that echoes Proust, is about memory reconsolidation.
That's the work by Nader, Schaaf, Ledoux with the rats.
Yes, back in 2000, they found if they blocked a protein synthesis, which is needed to stabilize memories, while the rat was recalling a fearful memory.
The original memory trace got erased.
Were significantly weakened, yeah. The very act of remembering makes the memory fragile, changeable again.
So it's not like pulling up a fixed file from a hard drive.
Not at all. That older photograph model is wrong. This discovery shows a memory is only as real, or maybe as stable, as the last time you remembered it.
And remembering it changes it, makes it less accurate over time.
That seems to be the implication. Proust totally got this intuitively. He knew memory is inseparable from the moment of recollection. Your current mood, your current self, distorts the past.
Like his nostalgia for Cambrai, remembering it as better than it was.
The only paradise is paradise lost. That kind of thing. The sources put it bluntly. No way to describe the past without lying. Memories are fiction.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is, and there's that irony the sources mention. Proust declaring only certain characters in his novel were real, blurring life and fiction, memory and invention. A memory is like a Xerox of a Xerox, getting fuzzier each time. To remember is, in a way, to misremember.
But what about those really vivid, involuntary memories, like Proust's Madeline moment? They feel so true, so immediate.
Right, those bienheureux, happy moments. They seem to exist outside this constant recalling and reworking. They just appear, feeling more authentic perhaps because they haven't been consciously recalled and distorted repeatedly.
And older science struggled with those, right? Needing repetition for memory.
Yeah, how do you explain these powerful single-exposure memories that pop up unexpectedly? This leads into the search for the molecules of long-term memory.
Like Eric Kandel and Kausick Tsai's work.
Exactly. Their discovery of the CPEB protein in sea slugs. And it's a prion.
A prion, like in mad cow disease.
Related mechanism, yes, a protein that can change its shape and function and influence other proteins to do the same without needing new genetic instructions. But in this case, it seems crucial for maintaining long-term memories.
How does it work?
It's very stable, resists the usual cellular turnover. It can be activated by neurotransmitters like serotonin or dopamine associated with significant events. Once activated, it seems to lock in the synaptic changes needed for long-term memory storage.
So CPEB could be the physical basis for how memories last, even unconscious ones.
It's a leading hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And the sources suggest this requires new metaphors for memory, definitely not a perfect mirror. Prions have this element of randomness. They can activate unexpectedly. They don't mind fibbing, in a sense. They seem liberated from rigid control.
Which kind of feels right for memory, doesn't it? It's unpredictability.
It does. It embraces that essential randomness.
Yeah.
Memory obeys nothing but itself, in a way. Proust knew the past is never truly past. Our memories are wonderfully volatile, a mercurial mirror, reflecting who we are now as much as what happened then.
Okay, from memory to sight, Paul Cézanne and the process of sight.
Cézanne, moving beyond just capturing appearance, beyond that pseudoscientific fidelity that painting was obsessed with before photography. He wanted a deeper reality.
The eye is not enough. One needs to think as well. That was his view.
Yes. He inverted the common idea that sight is just about light hitting the eye. He understood that impressions require interpretation. To look is to actively create what you see.
How did that differ from the Impressionists, like Monet?
Well, Monet and others were intensely focused on capturing light, the fleeting impression. Monet is only an eye, was the famous, slightly critical quote. Cézanne, especially after photography could capture light perfectly, stopped competing on that level. His art became, as the sources say, a mirror held up to the mind.
Photography really did force painting to rethink its purpose.
Massively. Baudelaire criticized photography's literal accuracy as deceptive. He thought true art captured the transient, fleeting contingent, which, ironically, Monet did brilliantly. But Cézanne focused on something else, something more than just light.
And then neuroscience had a breakthrough that really resonated with Cézanne's ideas.
Hubel and Weissel's Nobel Prize-winning work in the 50s, studying cat vision.
What did they find?
They found that the first neurons processing visual information in the cortex, in V1, don't respond to just dots of light like pixels in a camera.
Yeah.
They respond to edges and lines at specific angles.
So the very first stage of cortical processing is already abstract. It's not a raw image.
Exactly. It's the world before it has been seen, in a way. This initial abstraction introduces ambiguity, which then allows for subjective interpretation by higher brain areas.
And neuroscience shows vision is processed twice, bottom up and top down.
Right. Bottom up is the raw data coming from the retina. Top down is the interpretation flowing back from higher brain regions, your expectations, memories, context.
And that top-down processing actually changes the raw data. It doctors it.
It absolutely does. It imposes form, makes sense of ambiguity, fills in gaps based on what it expects to see. Without this top-down influence, reality would be just, well, noise. Unrecognizable.
Like Oliver Sacks's patient, Dr. P.
Exactly. His world apparently looked like a Cézanne painting, fragmented, abstract, because he lost that ability to interpret the visual input, to impose meaning.
So Cézanne's abstract style wasn't just a choice. It reflected a deep understanding of how vision actually works.
It seems so. He knew the raw impression wasn't enough. The mind has to complete it. His paintings are abstract, in part because everything we see is already an abstraction, an illusion created by our brain imposing its ideas onto raw sensation.
And his later style, leaving parts of the canvas blank. non-finito.
That was like a visual metaphor for this process. The brain automatically fills in those details, following Gestalt principles. We need this filling in. It's how our brain hides our own blind spot, for example.
The brain influences the eye even before the signal gets far.
Massively. The lateral geniculate nucleus, the visual relay station in the thalamus, gets 10 times more connections back from the cortex than it gets from the eye itself.
So the brain is telling the eye what to look for, in a way.
Or at least heavily shaping what gets through. We make our eyes lie, as the source puts it.
Like William James's analogy, sensation is the client, but the brain is the lawyer presenting the case.
A great analogy. The mind isn't a passive camera just recording reality. Seeing is an active imagination construction. It's private, subjective.
Cézanne's paintings expose our dishonest subjectivity.
They reveal how sight itself is like art bent to fit the brain's canvas, created by the cortex.
From sight to sound now, Igor Stravinsky.
Ah, Stravinsky. And the famous riot at the premiere of The Rite of Spring in 1913.
Why? How could music cause a riot?
That's the question. Stravinsky fundamentally challenged the idea of fixed, universal beauty in music. He knew our sense of what sounds pretty or right is learned, malleable. Music is sound we learn to hear.
And the brain processes music by looking for patterns.
Yes, desperately seeking patterns. When sound gets complex, like in the right, the auditory cortex works overtime, using short-term memory to find melodies, rhythms, structures. The brain needs order. It's obsessed with prediction.
So music works by setting up expectations based on those patterns.
Exactly. Your brain finds a pattern, predicts what comes next, the next note, the next chord, and music plays with those predictions.
That's where tension and release come from.
Precisely. Music gets exciting when the brain struggles to confirm its predictions. Avoiding the expected resolution, like delaying the home chord, the tonic, builds tension. Finally getting that resolution brings emotional release. Ah, the pattern is complete.
And Stravinsky, in the right, just threw all that out the window.
Pretty much. His antagonistic philosophy was all about violation. He deliberately refused the audience's expectations. He showed tension comes from conflict with what the listener wants and expects to hear. The dissonance, the harshness, it just keeps coming, rarely resolving conventionally.
And the audience reacted so violently because it was neurologically frustrating.
That's the argument in the sources, yes. The brain is an organ of habit built on learned associations. When all your ingrained musical expectations are constantly thwarted, made useless, it creates intense frustration, maybe even anger.
His method was a deliberate breakdown of patterns.
A sustained assault on them. He murdered old patterns, chopping up folk melodies, using chords in jarring, blocky ways. He forced the audience to confront their own deeply learned expectations about music.
The sadistic newness, as it was called.
Yes, the refusal to conform. You just couldn't predict what was coming next. And Stravinsky believed that true musical expression required that uncertainty. If music isn't ambiguous, if it just gives you what you expect, it expresses nothing very deep. The right denies easy satisfaction. It mocks conventional expectations.
And neuroscience talks about prediction errors.
Yes, the brain learns by association. If this sound, then probably that sound next. Music like Stravinsky's bombards the brain with prediction errors. Nope, not that sound. Neurons in the brainstem react strongly to surprising sounds.
And this triggers dopamine.
Yes, this neural process is linked to dopamine release, a key chemical for intense emotions, pleasure, but also learning and attention. It helps reorganize the auditory cortex. So by violating expectations, music taps into very fundamental brain circuits involved in emotion and learning.
It's amazing he intuitively knew how to manipulate our neural wiring.
Didn't need the brain scanner, he had the riot as proof.
Okay, let's move to Gertrude Stein and language. How can grammar be?
Stein. Writing when literature and psychology were kind of splitting apart. Psychology, the new psychology, was getting obsessed with measurement, maybe losing touch with subjective experience.
But her teacher, William James, pushed back against that.
He did. He argued you couldn't just reduce the mind to measurable bits. He stressed the importance of the transitive parts of thought, the connections, the relationships, the feeling of and the feeling of if, like the connecting words in a sentence.
And Stein wanted to explore that inner world using language.
Yes. Influenced by James, she wanted to look and see inside. She challenged traditional language, trying to make words right without sense, like in Tender Buttons. What's left when conventional meaning disappears?
But psychology was heading in the opposite direction with behaviorism.
Right. Skinner and others, focusing only on observable behavior stimulus, response. The brain was a black box. Humans were just reflex machines shaped by the environment.
And their view of language was really basic.
Super basic. Learning was just associating words with things through reinforcement. See a rose, say red, get praised. They thought language was basically solved. Words just mirrored sensory associations.
But Stein's work, even the really strange stuff, showed the flaws in that.
Absolutely. Her grammatically correct but nonsensical sentences like pink cut pink, they expose an underlying structure that behaviorism just ignored. Grammar isn't just a set of learned stimulus response rules. There's no rule stopping pink cut pink from being grammatical. The same syntax can create infinite meanings or non-meanings.
Which brings us straight to Noam Chomsky.
Exactly. Chomsky famously argued behaviorism couldn't explain the sheer creativity of language, how we constantly produce and understand novel sentences. He proposed an innate, abstract, deep structure, a universal grammar.
A set of rules hardwired in our brains.
Yes, allowing for limitless expression, not just learned associations.
And the sources argue Stein's experiments actually anticipated Chomsky.
In a way, yes. Her repetitions, like what is cut by it, what is cut by it in, they might seem odd, but they highlight this underlying structure. They reveal how words relate across distance in a sentence, long-distance dependencies. A simple stimulus-response machine couldn't make sense of shine. Only a mind with innate grammar could.
Is there real-world proof for universal grammar?
The emergence of Nicaraguan Sign Language is often cited as powerful evidence. First-generation deaf children created a basic sign system. But the next generation, younger children exposed to it, spontaneously imposed complex grammatical rules, creating a full language without explicit teaching. They drew on innate knowledge.
So Stein, by trying to break language, actually revealed its unbreakable foundation.
That's the argument. She pushed the boundaries, questioned conventions, and her failure to write pure nonsense was her success. She found you can't fully dismantle language because its structure is part of our brain structure.
The innate grammar Chomsky described was the instinct she couldn't escape.
As she put it, perfectly capturing the mystery. How can grammar be? Nevertheless, it just is.
Incredible. Finally, Virginia Woolf and the fiction of the self.
Woolf. Her insights, often stemming from her own experiences with mental illness, were profound. She saw the mind as incredibly fluid, shifting, plural. How hard it is to sum someone up.
The self feels solid, but it's maybe just a thin surface.
A veneer over constantly changing impressions, yes. The tension in her work is exploring that fragility, wondering why we don't just dissolve into fragments.
Her idea of reality emerging from shivering fragments.
And her call in modern fiction to record the atoms of experience as they fall in the mind, tracing patterns without forcing them into a rigid plot or fixed character.
This contrasted with the older neurological view of consciousness being in one spot.
Yeah, the idea of a single center like the left hemisphere, with brain parts understood in isolation. But then came Sperry and Gazzaniga's split brain studies in the 60s.
Cutting the connection between the hemispheres.
Right, and showing consciousness wasn't localized. It emerged from the whole brain's activity. More than that, they showed our feeling of being a unified self is a kind of story the brain tells itself.
A mental confabulation.
Exactly. The brain invents a narrative to make sense of its own contradictions and the different things happening in different parts. Woolf captured this perfectly. Am I here or am I there? The self is varied, wandering.
But it's a paradox, isn't it? She tried to deconstruct the self, show it was fragments.
But found it stubbornly real, or at least necessary. The more she poked at it, the more essential the idea of the self became, even if it was a construct.
Like her characters, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay, seeing the world through totally different subjective lenses.
Exactly. Life breaks in, constantly challenging any simple, fixed notion of self.
So her conclusion was that the self is a kind of illusion, a sleight of mind.
Like a novelist creating a narrative, yes. A fiction the brain constructs to create order from potential chaos. But crucially, a necessary fiction. Without that authorial self creating the story of our experience, perhaps subjective experience itself wouldn't exist in the way we know it.
Neuroscience has things like blind sight that seem relevant here.
Yes, patients with visual cortex damage who can physically react to things they claim they can't see. They lack conscious visual awareness.
Their consciousness is separated from the raw sensation.
It seems so. They can't subjectively interpret the input. It suggests that a sensation, to be a conscious sensation for us, needs to be integrated into that higher level sense of self.
So perception requires the self.
It points that way. And the scientific hunt for the neural correlate of consciousness, the NCC, trying to find the exact brain activity for a specific experience.
Like seeing red.
Right. But finding the NCC for red doesn't explain the self that is experiencing the redness. The subjective quality, the I, doing the seeing.
The self feels like more than just the sum of its parts.
It does. And artists like Woolf excel at describing this aspect of experience that science struggles to capture objectively. The self feels intensely real, even though it's ultimately rooted in biology, in chemicals, and electricity. It's a paradox.
So science perhaps has to accept the limits of purely objective knowledge when it comes to the self.
The sources suggest that, yes, that subjective experience, the kind Woolf explored, holds truths that experiments might miss. Self-awareness haunts science because the self seems to be this necessary fiction.
Understanding ourselves fully means understanding ourselves as this fiction.
That's the provocative idea, echoing the poet Wallace Stevens. The final belief is to believe in a fiction, there being nothing else. Believing in the necessary story our brain tells us.
Wow. Okay, this has been quite a journey through this deep dive, seeing how these incredible artists were, in their own ways, investigating the mind.
Decades, sometimes centuries, before neuroscience had the tools. It's amazing.
From Whitman seeing the body was key to feeling.
Eliot sensing freedom within chaos.
Yeah.
Escoffier understanding subjective taste.
Proust knowing memory was fragile, fictional. Cézanne seeing that sight is constructed.
Stravinsky manipulating our brain's expectations with sound. Stein revealing innate grammar by trying to break it.
And Woolf exploring the self as this beautiful, necessary illusion.
They were all pioneers, exploring the mind from the inside out.
And putting their insights together with modern neuroscience really shows we need both perspectives, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Objective science is crucial, but it's incomplete without the subjective truths art reveals. We need that third culture the sources talk about, one that embraces this pluralism.
And that fundamental mystery remains, how does matter become conscious?
Right, like the neurosurgeon in McEwen's Saturday, pondering the brain he's operating on. How does this mere wet stuff make this bright inward cinema?
With the self, that brightly wrought illusion at the center.
A ghost in the machine, almost. It's a question that maybe doesn't have a simple answer.
And yet, art works. As that novel shows, a character defined by science, by genetics, can be deeply moved by a poem. Poetry sways matter.
Unlikely, but real. The world is large, contains multitudes, as Whitman said, and artists keep that complexity, the frailties and question marks, on our agenda.
So, a final thought maybe for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive.
If our sense of self is, as these sources powerfully suggest, this kind of beautiful and necessary fiction that your brain creates to make sense of its own complexity, what does that mean for how you understand who you really are?